achieve for their country, their party, and themselves.
So many of us arrive up here with ambitions. I'm young enough to defer them for a lengthy period of time.
They might rise all the way up to the very top. So whether that would be for me or not is something that history will determine.
Ambition to leave a mark in history.
It is only natural that if you set your heart on a particular career, that you set your heart on going to the top.
I keep being told by the media that I should take a long-term visionary view.
We think we're pretty good, and we are.
What effect does a leader's ambition have on the people? In this series, we will see how the Government of Australia became the machinery for one leader's ambition to change the nation's idea of itself and its place in the world.
We honour those who faced the night. Not a night of rest nor dreams, but a monstrous corruption of nature. And yet when we look at the night sky, the wonder we feel is surely for the stars, not for the black veil behind them.
John Howard's view was a practical one. He drove his government's agenda from a very personal sense of what was right and wrong. Closest to his heart was nationalism, with a particular place for the spirit of Anzac.
Just unbelievable. I mean, it's something very special to be an Australian, no matter what the circumstances are, but you are put in awe of the Australian spirit when you come to a place like this. It really does move me very deeply.
Howard clearly identified with Australia's military past and with Australian nationalism. He believed that in war, the true qualities of a nation, if you like, are made evident.
You've got to understand in good governments you need 4 or 5 warriors who really sort of drive the agenda for the government. And in the Howard government, other than John Howard himself, who is a mighty warrior, that Peter Costello was certainly a warrior, a very important warrior for the government. There were 2 or 3 others. I mean, Peter Reith was very much a warrior. I guess people would say I was. Probably that's true.
Howard had been a domestic politician, but as Prime Minister, he would gather foreign experience and his international decisions would change the nation. Within the Howard cabinet, he and the man he replaced as party leader formed a club of 2. Together, they set about repositioning Australia's foreign policy.
The relationship between Australia and the United States had increasingly been taken for granted, and the relationship between Australia and the United Kingdom had become very tired. I said very early in my Prime Ministership that Australia should never have to choose between her history and her geography.
This made early trips to Asia somewhat uncomfortable. Many remembered his 1988 suggestion that Asian immigration be slowed, and he carried also the burden of Pauline Hanson's notoriety and the spectre of Australian racism.
We abhor all racism, and Australia is a very tolerant country. It has a multicultural society, and ethnic diversity is something we're very proud of in Australia, and so is our long-standing tradition of tolerance.
I was travelling in the region at the time, and there were some reservations about the style too, the style of our diplomacy. It tended to be, for a new government, seemed to be somewhat assertive and prescriptive.
If you go up to Asia breathlessly asking to be accepted and wringing your hands and worrying whether your own society is acceptable to Asia, at the end of the day, not only do I think that's embarrassing, but you're not going to get very far.
Without Australia's contribution, the world would be a less secure and a less compassionate place.
A couple of early overseas trips did not go well for John Howard. And I can remember the first one that I went on. It was awful. We couldn't do a thing right. We sort of went to New York because one of our car manufacturers was exporting vehicles to the US.
Well, thank you.
You've got these awful sort of visuals of this along this trip. We went to Washington to see President Clinton. He didn't look good.
John Howard and Bill Clinton had a good relationship, but it wasn't a relationship of great friendship. There wasn't a great common bond between men. The thing to say is that as time went on, John Howard did become more comfortable with foreign policy and dealing with foreign leaders. That wasn't his natural experience or comfort zone right to start with.
His first few years were very ropey. It was a very uncertain government. He knew what he was about, but he wasn't getting this across. The climate didn't quite suit him.
Howard very nearly lost government in 1998, and by early 2001, his support had sunk to just 30%.
It's the lowest Morgan poll figure since my father started polling in 1940s.
But across the horizon, a gathering storm swept in that played to John Howard's strengths and certainties.
Australia's never been invaded since the British first invaded it. The threat from outside has not been perceived, for the most part, as a military threat. It's always been perceived as a demographic threat. And because the borders are so permeable, Australia's midnight fear is of people arriving by boats.
You didn't need a pollster to tell you that the public was getting increasingly alarmed about illegal immigration. I mean, every week virtually boats were arriving with large numbers of people, and I was finding it increasingly difficult to explain to the Australian people how long we could go on accepting this.
The Norwegian ship was asked by Australian Rescue Authority to come to the assistance of this ship in distress, and they rescued these people from the sure death. The normal is that it would be allowed to an Australian port or to the nearest port to land these people.
The government, having taken legal advice on this matter and having considered it very carefully this morning, has indicated to the ship's captain that it does not have permission to enter Australian territorial waters.
Australia has no obligation under international law to accept the rescued persons into Australian territory.
Despite concerns about their health, Australia has refused point blank to let them land.
Maritime experts say Australia has jeopardised the time-honoured practice of saving people at sea.
The only relevant thing now is that you should do everything possible to end the suffering of these people.
They flatly refused to go back to Indonesia or Singapore. I was afraid for the life of everybody on board and for the ship itself.
Basically, this ship's captain was being told, you are not to come into Australian waters without authority, and you know, he was playing ducks and drakes with us, and we thought he was going to abide by that.
These people are not taking food, so they're getting weaker and weaker by the hour.
In the waters between Indonesia and Australia, shades of the Voyage of the Damned. That was the name given to the ship which carried Jews fleeing the Nazis in 1939.
We are a decent people. We don't behave in a way that causes people to drown and to die. We don't shoot people. And it's probably because of that that we are seen by many around the world as a soft touch.
It was as though they wanted to adopt a sort of Churchillian stand, you know, that we will fight them on the beaches. We will stop them coming, no matter what.
And I got a call from John, and he said, oh, they are going in, and so you better instruct the Chief of the Defence Force to, give the green light to the operation. So I went back to my office and I said, Chief of the Defence Force, I'm giving you instructions to board that ship.
John Howard clearly is a strong leader. What he offers the electorate, the people of Australia, is protection from threat. Now, to protect from threat, you have to convince people that there are threats out there. And lots of people do believe there are threats out there.
I think he's absolutely correct.
We've been generous, and I think that some people are abusing that. And I know it's pretty cruel, I know things are bad, but you know, you've got to draw the line. Other countries do it, so why can't we?
Oh, I think they're parasites. They're the parasites of our society in this country.
We were getting a lot of calls from people indicating to us that we should send the Navy out there and sink these boats, that we should turn these boats around. We should have been turning these boats around all along. I was shocked at the hardline attitude of some of these callers, and I think that we had uncovered a darker element in the Australian psyche here.
Well, people's fears had been aroused, and fears on the basis of race or religion or coming from a place that we didn't know or didn't understand. And if a government plays on those fears and magnifies those fears, then it's a potent political force.
Tampa was ordered to hand over the refugees for processing on Nauru, an island outside Australian territorial waters. This was called the Pacific Solution.
Very problems because of bad ruling of Taliban. So they didn't accept us as a human.
You know, the Taliban forces are very dangerous in Afghanistan. They don't want to be, especially our Hazara people, they don't want us to live in Afghanistan.
The Pacific Solution was the most unfortunate name given historical connotations. And I guess for me, there was a growing sense of anger that people could be treated like that in this day and age, especially when they had come to our country looking for refuge.
That stopped the boats coming. And nothing anybody says, nothing the human rights organisations say, nothing the Labor Party says can alter that fundamental fact. I think the Australian public worked all of that out, and that's why they strongly supported us on it.
The time suddenly suited Howard. Howard was a strong leader at a time when not just the core group, but a much larger group could be persuaded this is what we want.
Howard's relationship with the electorate was secured, and for someone initially uneasy on the world stage, he would soon derive from immigration and foreign affairs growing self-belief and remarkable electoral success. In Washington for the 50th anniversary of ANZUS, Howard met Bill Clinton's successor.
I spoke to him on the phone twice, but I never met him face to face.
George Bush at this stage was very much a rookie and even less experienced internationally than Howard had been.
I hope the Australian press is kinder to you than the American press has been.
Have you heard that, Dennis? You just listen to the man. He speaks great common sense.
Mr. Howard, how have you found the discussion so far with Mr. Bush?
Very good. I mean, we are very close friends. We covered just about everything you could cover in the time. We're going to continue over lunch. There is no relationship more natural, more easy, and one more deeply steeped in common aspiration for the kind of world we all want our children to grow up in than the relationship between Australia and the United States.
Howard decided to unilaterally make the relations with the United States our single most important relationship. And of course that was warmly welcomed by your Cheneys, Rumsfelds and George W. Bush, who were at that time starting to consider what they might do about Iraq.
It appears to be a most horrific, awful event that will obviously entail a very big loss of life.
What was your reaction when you saw those pictures?
Oh, dreadful. Just appalling. Awful. I pulled the curtains aside and you could see the smoke coming up from the Pentagon. Well, where am I going?
Howard's proximity to this moment was crucial. It would transform his confidence, his leadership, and his country's history. From now on, Australia's foreign policy was tied to America's.
One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Chair extends on behalf of the House his appreciation for the solidarity of the Australian people and the presence of the Prime Minister today in this very difficult time. Thank you.
John Howard was enormously influenced by that, a cornerstone element of his own being and of his own beliefs and of his own stewardship over Australia's interests, the relationship which he had with the United States of America and most particularly with George W. Bush. Nothing was going to supplant that in order of importance.
The United States government arranged for me to fly out of Andrews Air Force Base in Washington on Air Force Two, and it was in fact the first aircraft to leave American airspace after the attack.
I was aware, and Amanda Vanstone was aware, that this would lead to war. It was just a question of who with.
More than 70 people have been detained in the last few days, some offering potentially vital leads. In this run-down Detroit house, police found 3 Arab men with a host of suspicious documents.
America wanted an answer and retribution. Al-Qaeda was held responsible, but its apparent leader, bin Laden, couldn't be found. A US hunt for Muslim terrorists began.
In the Australian context, people felt suddenly very vulnerable. We'd had concerns about people arriving by boat, but the thought that an enemy would target our culture and our politics by flying into our heartland, disturb people in ways they'd not been disturbed. Attacks on Muslims start to grow very dramatically, particularly on women wearing the veil.
The mosque in Brisbane South was destroyed by...
The latest target in a series of anti-Muslim attacks.
Mosques around the country staff had received threats just days before.
Anybody who harbors terrorists needs to fear the United States and the rest of the free world.
He requested us to make available in circumstances and at times to be agreed. It will not be an easy operation.
This, in a way, plays to Howard, because Howard wants to see himself as a strong leader defending Australia in a threatening world. And so the war on terror and refugees are part of the problem. Strong responses are necessary.
A federal election was approaching. A few months ago, the government was given little chance. But with the electoral fortunes of war playing, a Howard victory was now a foregone conclusion. And refugee boats were still arriving.
We are a generous, open-hearted people, taking more refugees on a per capita basis than any nation except Canada. We have a proud record of welcoming people from 140 different nations. But we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
Howard would see that as an issue about the protection of Australia's shores and the integrity of the processes by which refugees are selected to become members of the Australian community. That was the way he wanted to see it. However, the people on those boats were Middle Easterners, people racially different. So there was a racial undercurrent, whether Howard liked it or not.
Our security people, in fact, have found that quite a few of those people who have come in do have criminal backgrounds.
There's an undeniable linkage between illegals and terrorists.
More disturbingly, a number of children have been thrown overboard.
There was a meeting and one of the defence people, really inside conversation, mentioned that there'd been a report that someone had seen children being thrown over the side of the boat. And a very senior public servant who overheard that decided that that was a rather interesting story that his minister might want to hear. When very soon afterwards it was found that that was in fact not the observation, that they were trying to rescue the children or throwing them over for their welfare, it was too late and the political ball was running.
I can't comprehend how genuine refugees would throw their children overboard.
They will not be welcome in the mainland of Australia and they will not be integrated into our community. It's not going to happen.
You can't reward people for that sort of behaviour.
Mr. Reith, there's nothing in this photo that indicates these people either jumped or were thrown.
Well, you're now questioning the veracity of reports from the Royal Australian Navy. I don't. It's as clear as day.
But
so do you still question it?
Do you? I'm a journalist. I'll question anything until I get the proof. That's my job.
I've just given you the evidence.
No, you've given me images.
Well,
and
Virginia,
if I can reply
quite
to your
frankly,
question
if you
now.
don't accept that, you don't accept anything I say.
In my mind, there is no uncertainty because I don't disbelieve the advice I was given by Defence.
The public service took the heat. Ministers had this tactic of what was called plausible deniability. In other words, there was a problem, but they hadn't been told about the problem. They denied knowing.
There are very few politicians who want to confront a situation where they have to go back to the people and say, look, what I told you earlier is not entirely true. They feel that essentially it's time to move on and that, okay, well, we may have made a mistake, but let's not rehash old ground.
It's a beauty. Here it is.
We believe Australia is the best country in the world, and we must do more for border protection and defence to keep it that way.
It's like people in Australia saw politicians as having a job to do, and if they felt the person was doing the job quite well, they didn't necessarily agree with everything, but actually it was that person's job to make the decisions. There was like a sort of delegation of a whole sense of moral responsibility. That's quite different from how a lot of the concerned political class see politics. They feel a much stronger sense of identification between themselves and the particular decisions that the national leaders are taking. So they say, we feel ashamed to be Australians.
You realise we're now at war because of you?
But it's actually quite a small section of the electorate.
I
like the Labor member.
Howard had won another battle. The Labor casualty was Kim Beazley.
Headed back to Canberra. And then what? Clean out the office.
But on the government side, a warrior was lost.
There is only one Peter Reith. I mean, Peter Reith leaving in 2001 was a very big loss. It was sort of there were four of us and then there were three.
4 months after the September 11 attacks, America was moving its focus in the war on terror from Afghanistan to Iraq.
And as we and our coalition partners are doing in Afghanistan, we will bring to the Iraqi people food and medicines and supplies and freedom.
America has no better friends anywhere in the world than Australia. Thank you for what you are doing, not only for your own nation, for the cause of freedom, but also for mankind generally around the world.
It wasn't long before Australia felt something of America's trauma and its search for an identifiable enemy.
He said that the group, because the Americans suppressed the Muslim, so they want to take refunds for that. So he wants to kill Americans.
I think these people are so bloodthirsty. Their sort of ugly, sneering, amused attitude at the slaughter of innocent people. It's just horrific that there are people like that.
It's frightening.
Well, you don't know where they're going to strike next. It could be Sydney, could be Perth, could be anywhere, could be on a train, could be on a ferry. I mean, even if they blow a shopping centre up.
Do you think Australia can still be a strong ally of the US without backing any military action?
I don't deal in hypothetical situations, I deal in reality.
Howard had pledged to provide whatever support was requested by America. Terrorism was the bond for one of the closest political relationships between leaders of these two countries.
Australia was doing two things. They were almost encouraging the Americans, telling them if they went in, we'd be with them. And secondly, starting to prepare through media briefing the Australian public for going to war in Iraq.
With the UN still waiting for evidence of the weapons of mass destruction, the Australian government sent its first troops to the Persian Gulf, using the term pre-positioning.
The intelligence I saw was, to me, persuasive about Saddam's possession of weapons of mass destruction.
Thanks a lot.
Good luck to you.
We have the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I better go. I had a brief discussion with George Tenet only a few months ago, the former head of the CIA, and he said I was satisfied. I thought there was a very strong case. He said the intelligence turned out to be short of the mark, but he said we didn't make it up. Nobody makes up stuff like that. You never, with intelligence, have proof beyond all reasonable doubt. If you wait for that, you'll have a Pearl Harbor.
The security of the world requires disarming Saddam Hussein now. And tonight, as we have done before, America and our allies accept that responsibility. Good night, and may God continue to bless America.
I know that the Iraq War was unpopular in this country, and a lot of that hostility from certain people was directed towards me, but I don't know that it overly bothered me. It's part of the job that from time to time, whilst being very conscious of the majority view on an issue in the Australian public, you will believe it's in the nation's interest to pursue a different course.
For 2 years, John Howard had been one of the Bush family's most frequent guests. But in November 2003, he was able to return the favour. In fact, on consecutive days, he hosted two men, the leader of the world's sole superpower
Can't get any better than that.
and the leader of the nation most likely to eclipse it.
Lovely to see you again.
China's president, Hu Jintao, was here for trade talks and to oversee vast mineral and energy deals. Both men addressed Parliament.
We are ready to be your long-term and stable cooperation partner, dedicated to closer cooperation based on equality and mutual benefit.
Prime Minister John Howard is a leader of exceptional courage, who exemplifies the finest qualities of one of the world's greatest democracies. Proud to call him friend. Americans know Australia as a land of independence. We must know firsthand.
Will resume her seat. Senator Nettle will resume her seat. The President has the call. Sergeant will remove Senator Nettle.
I love free speech.
those 2 days were a metaphor of what Australian foreign policy had delivered and what we had achieved over the time that we'd been in government. And it spoke powerfully to the world and to the region and to the Australian people of where we had come.
If you're probably looking for the year where John Howard was at the peak of his game, I'd say it would be around 2003. He had no peer in politics at that point. The Labor Party were down in the dumps. Now, John Howard probably should have snap frozen that moment and realised that it doesn't get any better than that.
The next year, Howard was again in trouble.
We teach our children to tell the truth. The Australian people deserve a Prime Minister who tells the truth, and that's what we need in the future.
Labor's new leader was popular and seemed to offer a fresh alternative. A Morgan poll reported 40% thought Mark Latham was more honest and trustworthy. Only 28% went for John Howard.
The allegation that was made was that we took the country to war based on a lie. And we just lied to the Australian public.
Do you think it's established in the minds of Australians that you didn't lie?
Well, some people will not believe me, no matter what I say about anything. I mean, that's the nature of Australian politics, Paul.
The public was getting more and more cynical about politicians in general, about Howard in particular. And when you stood up and said, this man is telling lies, the electorate's answer would be, tell me something I don't know. And Howard played on that. These people were always telling the gallery, the public doesn't care about being lied to. Why are you making so much fuss?
Prime Minister Tony Blair has told a meeting of the Labor Party in Britain that politicians aren't always able to tell the truth. Do you agree with that statement?
I always tell the truth.
John Howard, when his back was to the wall and Labor had a lead in the polls and people were starting to doubt whether, John Howard could overcome again. He was, at all those times, at his best. He would persist, he would look for that chink and exploit that weakness.
Who do you trust to keep interest rates low, and who they better trust to lead Australia in the fight against international terrorism? It is a question of who do you better trust to manage Australia. How are you, Mark?
Good, how are you?
I'm very well. Good to see you. You too. Okay. Thank you.
This fourth election win was Howard's most emphatic. It made him the second longest serving Prime Minister in Australia's history and gave the government control of both Houses of Parliament.
John Howard always struck me as someone who had to struggle to get what he wanted. He was always a man who acted like he had a monkey on his back, whatever the latest problem was, and his challenge was to get the monkey off his back. I've always seen him as a bit of an inspiration to younger people who think that they can never get anywhere.
John Howard had secured his place and his self-belief. He was an international figure, a close friend of the American president, but he also had now made his mark at home. Australians were rallying to the uncritical nationalism he advocated and sharing in growing numbers his deep passion for its symbols.
We've seen this wonderful phenomenon of the young being drawn to the military legends of the country. Now, I'm not claiming credit for that. I certainly helped to promote it, but it was a process that was there anyway, and I certainly endeavoured as Prime Minister to reinforce that, but it's something that people wanted. It was their nature.
The national narrative that Howard was telling was reaching its crescendo during the latter part of his leadership. In that period, the flag was taking on a new dimension. It was a symbol of exactly the sorts of things that Howard wanted to bring forth, in particular sacrifice.
"90 years ago, as dawn began to break, the first sons of a young nation assailed these shores. These young Australians, with their New Zealand comrades, had come to do their bit in a maelstrom not of their making.
The London bombings sharpened the wedge between Islam and the West and introduced a new fear, homegrown terrorism.
There will be reprisals, there will be retaliations, be they verbal, insinuations, discrimination, physical assault. I mean, we've seen the gamut in the past with other terrorist attacks.
Anxieties in Australia escalated.
We shouldn't complacently imagine that there aren't potentially suicide bombers in this country. All of us are targets.
If you see anything suspicious, call the 24-hour National Security...
The government beefed up security legislation.
This afternoon, Philip Ruddock introduced the big one, the Anti-Terrorism Bill 2005. Legislative changes include a new preventative detention regime that allows suspects to be held for up to 14 days, new question and search powers, and tracking devices and travel restrictions for those the authorities believe pose a terrorist risk to the community.
In the early hours of this morning, more than 400 police raided homes in southwest Sydney as part of Australia's biggest counter-terrorism operation. Authorities say a terrorist cell was planning a catastrophic attack which could have killed hundreds of people.
We are involved in an historic struggle with Islamic fascism, and I believe that if Al-Qaeda and those associated with it are seen to win in Iraq, that will deliver an enormous blow to the United States and to Western influence in the Middle East and around the world, and will greatly embolden terrorism, particularly in our own region.
Howard believed that he alone could be an effective channel of the desires and needs of the Australian people. And the events of 9/11 and thereafter fed into this sense of a crusader on behalf of the Australian people against their enemies. And the crusade against their enemies was at times confused. For the Muslim community, people who for years had thought of themselves as Australian were suddenly told because of their beliefs they couldn't be Australian, or they weren't Australian, or they had to demonstrate in some super Australian way their commitment that was asked of nobody else.
And I think he had a conviction that he represented values which were fundamental to the Australian psyche, and that in some ways he was a more authentic interpreter of Australians to themselves than some other political leaders.
Our Muslim communities are continuing to develop their Australian identity. And who could possibly doubt that after having heard the wonderful singing of the choir tonight?
We feel safe. Our Prime Minister visiting us, we are really feel safe. We are really feel that we are Australian and we're contributing to this beautiful country.
The survey of high school students, 50% believe Muslims are terrorists, 40% believe they're unclean, and half thought Muslims behave strangely, and 34% agreed most Australians are racist.
Bill, hello. Alan, I just saw some snippet on News Channel 9 of the horrendous bashing, or if you like, gang attack on the beach at Cronulla yesterday. I mean, what type of grubs do we have in this? What kind of grubs? Well,
my suggestion is to invite one of the biker gangs to be present in numbers at Cronulla railway station when these Lebanese thugs arrive.
I do not accept that there is underlying racism in this country. I have always taken a more optimistic view of the character of the Australian people.
Do you think anything the government's said over the last few years has set the tone for the actions on the weekend?
Which government?
Your government.
My government?
Yes.
No, certainly not. What do you have in mind?
Your position on Iraq then?
My position on Iraq?
Do you think that's had any influence on people feeling alienated?
My position on Iraq? You've got to be joking.
I wasn't.
John Howard had vanquished 4 consecutive Labor leaders. In December 2006, the opposition put up a 5th.
I have a plan for the country's future, an education revolution, action on climate change, and a plan to fix our nation's hospitals.
The Australian people are not mugs. You branding yourself as an economic conservative is about as plausible as me converting to republicanism.
The Labor Party's attacks are just, rubber bullets off a Sherman tank.
There was astonishment among government members that the popularity of Kevin Rudd and the way in which he was dominating talk of the election, there was certainly a sense that if something didn't happen to stop this, that we could lose government.
I invite you, our friends and neighbours of the Asian Pacific region, to Australia for the APEC Australia 2007 year.
Howard planned APEC as a pre-election showcase. As in 2003, he would host the presidents of the US and China, this time along with many other powerful international figures.
He saw that hosting APEC and giving a very, very high public prominence to the strength of his relationships with George W. Bush, with Hu Jintao, with Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, with Vladimir Putin, that would resonate in the minds of the Australian people to the extent that they would say, let's stick with the devil we know and not with the devil we don't.
I thought we were in deep trouble. I thought we were in deep trouble all year, to tell you the truth. But of course I didn't go around telling a lot of people that, because that would undermine people's morale and confidence. I didn't want to do that. But I did talk about it with the Prime Minister.
But I was concerned about our prospects. The polls were very bad. And I said to Alexander Downer, in whom I had a lot of trust, he should, in effect, canvass opinion on our political situation. And I made it clear that if the great bulk of my senior colleagues were willing to publicly own a request for me to go, I'd go.
Nobody thought it was a good idea to tear down John Howard. But if John Howard retired and anointed Peter Costello as his successor, it might give us an outside chance of improving our situation. He said that he wouldn't just stand down, because to do so would be cowardly.
Mr. President, if I might conclude my remarks with some words of personal welcome to yourself as our honoured guest in this country. 胡主席先生，我代表我和我夫人对您表示我们个人的欢迎，到我们澳大利亚来访问。您和在座的中国朋友们。
When Rudd spoke Mandarin at APEC, I'm sure some of the Liberal strategists thought, aha, we'll be able to make him out to be an egghead now. But Australians on the whole know that much of our recent prosperity has been because of the boom in China. So I think the sort of egghead quality of Rudd being able to speak Mandarin was probably counterbalanced by the fact that, hey, here's a guy who can speak to the country that our money depends on.
Your Excellency, Mr. Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, Honourable John Howard, Prime Minister of Australia, Ministers, Ambassadors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen.
I can't imagine for the life of me how he actually pulled it off that week. It was the most surreal week that I've experienced in federal politics. At APEC, it almost took us all by surprise that the Howard aura collapsed right before our eyes.
Great to see you. Welcome. Welcome. To Australia.
Mr. Bush clearly in decline. Mr. Howard clearly in decline. Hu Jintao still at the zenith of his power, and Hu Jintao introduced to all of that lavish symbolism of the new Australian leader-in-waiting, who was not only the leader-in-waiting but a Chinese-speaking leader-in-waiting.
Howard's closeness to Bush has been an area of consternation in the Australian view, and I think this leads to an overall questioning of the moral character of the Howard government. As long as economic times were okay, people thought, well, we're a bit uneasy about this, we'll put them back. I think as time's worn on, people have started to think we're not entirely happy, Howard went too far.
Clearly Howard had played the politics of fear, and to some extent, I mean, it worked in 2001, but after a while, fear runs out, particularly if the threats don't eventuate, and people start to say, well, we're sick of this. There's a shift from the sort of conflict that Howard represented to a real desire for consensus.
Every election, in a sense, is about the future. In 2007, John Howard projected the past rather than the future. The only reason he wanted re-election was a validation of his personal story, which by that point had ceased to have any relevance for Australia.
The interest rates are a lot lower now than what they used to be. Thank you.
I think, embedded in the Australian political psyche a much more competitive and a much more individualised society than it had been when he came to power.
We bequeath to him a nation that is stronger and prouder. A nation that is stronger and prouder and more prosperous than it was 11 and a half years ago.
Howard was never really all that interested in opening up Australia's agenda to different voices. What he was interested in was writing the agenda himself and having all the other voices agree with what he'd written.
I suppose when history is written, the legacy of the Howard government in international affairs will not be substantial. I think that it will be seen that they tended to be excessively pro-American. I don't think that the Howard government will be seen as working towards a more tolerant and inclusive society, and I think that's unfortunate.
Love me or loathe me, the Australian people knew what I believed in and what I stood for. And I'm very proud of the fact that when I look back on my time in government, that I stood for things, I changed things, I achieved things, I did things. Not everybody agreed with them. Some people violently disagreed with many of the things that I did, but I did what I believed in, and nobody could say that I touched Australian politics lightly. Okay, right. I think that's enough there. Okay. We've got our respective right sides. There was overwhelming pressure on me not only to stay but also to say then that I was staying. And the truth is that all of my senior colleagues at that time said that I had to stay.
The United States honors John Winston Howard for his lifelong efforts to spread hope and freedom throughout the world.